Hey guys, welcome back. My name's Jahannah and this is Funny Old World. Today we're veering slightly off into the mysterious world of the Shroud of Turin. This particular subject has been a little obsession of mine for like 20 years. When I was probably about 12, 13, my dad gave me a book on the Shroud of Turin. He's like, I think you'll be interested in this. And he was right. I was. And if you don't know what the Shroud of Turin is, for everybody here, it is a artifact that is currently belonging to the Catholic Church, and it is a sort of 4 meter by 1.3 meter piece of ancient linen, a shroud that was supposedly the shroud that wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. And why it is particularly amazing is because it does have a very faint image of a man that looks like the kind of historical depiction of Jesus on there. There is like an image imprinted, or, well, we don't know how, but it's somehow on there. And anyway, so lots of debate about, is the shroud real? Is it not? In the 1980s, it was the church allowed the shroud to be carbon dated, and they cut off a little 8 centimetre square from the top left corner of the shroud. And when it went off to analysis, different places, and it came back that the shroud was, well, the carbon dating came from around 1260 to 1390 was like where the kind of 95% certainty of the carbon dating was. And so after that, after the carbon dating was kind of announced, a lot of people lost interest in the shroud because they were like, well, there's no way it could have been the Shroud of Jesus because it was made in the medieval times. Or was it? And now there is a new technique for dating fabric and old fibers, because you can literally track the deterioration rate of the cellulose in the fibers, and you can get a really accurate reading of how old the plant is. And they've done that on the Shroud of Turin, and it turns out that it is most likely 2,000 years old, which puts it right back at the date that it's needed to be even possible to be the Shroud of Jesus Christ. So that's very exciting. So they've scanned it, and turns out that the cellulose in the fabric is dating to, or up to 2,000 years old. So that's kind of really crazy, and it's kind of bringing the shroud back around again, and there's lots of analysis to be done. So I thought I would run through sort of what we know about the shroud, some amazing facts and details that are in the imagery of the shroud. And yeah, I don't know. I went down the rabbit hole about the Shroud of Turin this week, and I thought that you should come too. So come on. What can we rule out? Okay, because why the Shroud of Turin is so puzzling, and it was studied at depth by a lot of scientists and a lot of experts in all different kinds of fields, and they were kind of left scratching their head because there is no definitive answer to how the shroud was created, because the image that is encoded or encapsulated in the fabric, no one can work out how it was done, but they can rule out how it wasn't done. So that's, do you know what I mean? Using Sherlock Holmes' theory of once you rule out all the impossibles, what you're left with, however improbable, that's the answer. Do you know what I mean? So the image that is on the shroud, it is on, if you open the shroud out, it is the front image of a man and the back image of a man. But the image on the fabric is only on this side of the shroud. So the image doesn't soak through to the opposite sides. So paint and anything with sort of chemicals, any kind of painting technique that was used would soak kind of deeply into the fibers of the fabric and may appear, you can sort of see it at least partway through the fabric. I'm so excited. You would see it at least partway through the fabric, or it would be on the other side. And that doesn't happen. In fact, it is so microscopically on the surface of the fabric that it is only 200 nanometers into the very top surface of the fabric, of the linen. So to put that into context, that is less than a human hair. In fact, if you took a human hair and you cut 1/20th of a human hair, That's one of mine for, 1/20th of a human hair. That's 200 nanometers. And that is how much this image is on this fabric. It is not in the fabric itself, if that makes sense. It is literally just on top of the like toppest layer. And that's pretty incredible, because paint doesn't do that. Markings, etchings, sketchings, that doesn't happen. It goes in, goes right in. For more context, you could take a razor blade and shave the top of the fabric and we would lose the image, because that's how thin that is. They've put it under the micro, I've lost the word. Whatever the technical word is for looking at stuff under the microscope. Do you know what I mean? They just looked at it very, 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 very closely under the microscope, and they can do all sort of chemical analysis. And they've ruled out that it isn't any known man-made chemical. It's not a paint, it's not an ink, it's not a dye that they have yet, like chemically, that they've yet to find. There was one study in the 80s that thought that it was made of like an iron oxide, like a paint of a diluted iron oxide. But that was contested, so there's no like definitive, yes, it is 100% this. So at the moment, it's in the, we don't know what it is, but it's definitely not a known ink, paint, dye. They know that it is not a scorch, because that was another idea. Like maybe it was scorched in, or like laser imprinted on. The fabric isn't burnt. It's not scorched. Actually, in fact, we don't even have a laser, just to put it into perspective. We don't have a laser today that would be able to scorch fabric to that delicate level of the 200 nanometers. So we can rule out scorching. According to one study from the 80s, they said that the blood stains weren't real, but now there's been more analysis. They're saying the blood stains are real. And what is very interesting, if you were going to fake this as an artifact, you would draw the image on, or most logically, you would draw, or whatever mechanism you use to put the image onto the fabric, you would do that first, and then you would add the blood stains, right? Because you'd need to know where to put the blood based on the image that's on the fabric. However, that's not the way round this is, because the image is not found under the blood stains that are on the Shroud of Turin. So that means that the image came after the blood. So that's just another little riddle that we've got to get our heads around. The blood stains are real, and the blood stains soak through the fabric, whereas the image does not. The man in the image is anatomically correct. There was some contention because the back image and the front image were slightly different sizes, and so they were like, oh, haha, it's not real. However, the position that the gentleman would be lying in, it aligns with the position of having your knees bent at a certain angle. So the knees would be bent at a certain angle, and the body's in rigor mortis, so it's not they couldn't unbend the legs. So that I think accounts for why it's a bit shorter on the front or back. I can't remember which one it is now, because the legs are at an angle, which is actually the angle you would be if you died on the cross and your legs are bent, because you get your feet nailed in to the cross. Now, the image of the shroud, you can see a very faint image with the human eye, and that's why it's been this spectacular artifact for centuries. However, it wasn't until the Victorian times, in like 1890s or 1880s, when photography became a thing, and it was the first guy to photograph the shroud, and he did it, and when he went into the developing room and he found the photographic negative, that he was like, oh my god, literally. That looks like Jesus. So the whole image that we see in by the naked eye in the daylight is actually a photographic negative, which is crazy, because even if it was a medieval fake, that's still using sort of photographic imagery or photographic negative techniques centuries before the photograph was invented. And if it is original from the first century, that's like 19 centuries before photography was invented. We have an image that is encoded with a photographic negative. It's getting spicy. This is why I love it so much. Not only is it a photographic negative, but it's not just that. The image encodes 3D information. I'm going to try and explain this in the way that how I understand it, because I'm trying to get my head around it. But the image that we see on the shroud isn't it isn't colorized with darker pigments and lighter pigments, which is why there's a really strong argument that it's not a painting. So you don't it's not like it's shaded and shaded in lighter colors and darker colors. That's what I'm getting at. It is encoded with there is less pigment per fabric space on the areas where they want to represent light, and there is more densely formulated pigment, all of the same color, on the areas which they want to show up as darker. I've got something in my eye. Let me try that again. Got fluff in my eye. So yeah, it's not a case of using a lighter color and a darker color. It's the same color being used across the whole image, and the areas which are lighter has just less dots of the same color, and the areas that are darker have more concentrated dots. Does that make sense? So it is this exact sort of theory and process that you use to create 3D imaging today. So for example, NASA is able to capture images of faraway planets, and they can accurately map the topography of the surface of that planet from the image, because it is encoded with 3D information using essentially the same basic system. So in theory, you could take the image that is on the shroud and you could turn it into a 3D image, because the information is ingrained there, and you cannot do that totally with basic photography. The way that you make basic photography in images, it doesn't encode the same information. Does that make sense? The only thing that my brain could think of is that I got to try the Apple goggles, the Apple glass things in the Apple Store recently, and there is a new feature coming out to do with 3D imaging. So that's going to be the next thing over the next couple of years. All of our images are gonna, you can easily make them like 3D holograms and holographic images, and it was amazing. You should go and try it out, because it was like, but there is a difference between a normal photo and a 3D photo, and that was the only visual that I could kind of put in my head. Another interesting fact is that the shroud has been water damaged, because there is chemical evidence of water damage, but the water damage does not affect the image. So again, if it was pigment, paint, something that was basically could be damaged by water, it wasn't. The image stays consistent even though it's been damaged by water. It was also damaged by fire. Historically, the shroud was damaged in a fire in the 1500s and had to be repaired, because there is a historical record of nuns repairing the shroud, and the fire also didn't damage, the heat didn't damage the image. I think the bits of the fabric got damaged overall, but the image didn't get distorted or changed, or so survive heat and water. So ultimately, we can rule out a lot of things, but we still don't know what exact mechanism was used to capture the image. We can also rule out pareidolia, which is it's a phenomenon that's very, very common. It's like when you look into a cloud and you go, what can you see? And your brain will see shapes and things of what you want it to see or think it could see, because we're pattern searching brains. So we look for faces in things, and we can kind of animate objects with our brain very easily. The best one for me is the drunk octopus, which is on the back of the toilet door hook. For me, that I'm like, yeah, it looks like a drunk octopus trying to have a fight. So it's called pareidolia, and in studies about it, they find that particularly religious people can be very sensitive or more susceptible to pareidolia. You can really see what you really want to see. But we can rule that out. This image of Jesus is not the same as people finding or thinking they can see Jesus on a piece of toast or on a stain on the wall. Like, the image that is there is actually there, and it's got information, and it's anatomically correct, and this is not a case of pareidolia, so we can rule that out. Now, the carbon dating, we do need to address it. So in the 80s, the church, like I said, they gave full permission for the teams to come down, do a bunch of, or loads of tests, but they were specifically going to carbon date it. And they sent the carbon date off to 3 labs. It was Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. And they were going to go in independently. There was 8 centimeters from the top left corner, very, very top of the shroud. Because obviously with carbon dating, you have to burn up and disintegrate whatever it is you're carbon dating. So they agreed that a very small section could be cut away and destroyed. But it was not the section that had any of the imagery on. It was the top left corner only. So there are a couple of reasons why the carbon dating date might be skewed a bit by taking that particular section of the shroud. One, because the shroud has been traveling around for centuries, and before it was kept in a more of a conservative conservation place like now, the shroud was toured about, and people would hold the shroud up by the top left and right. There is images and depictions of people holding up the shroud. So this area is like one of the worst areas to carbon date, because it has literally been touched and fondled for centuries, and you're gonna have a bit of a squiffy carbon dating because it's been contaminated. It just has. That aside, after the 1530 something fire, when there was fire damage to the shroud, and especially around the top of the shroud, the nuns were charged with repairing the shroud, and a big effort went into trying to put back the Shroud of Jesus. And the theory is, and there is evidence, that the top section of the shroud is actually a medieval reweave. So what they would have done is a process, and you can do it, and it's very expensive to do and very time worthy, but obviously they were going to do it for the Shroud of Jesus. You would pull the fibers out, trim back the burnt fibers, and then you would be able to reweave in the exact same herringbone weave that the original shroud was in, and you reweave the last few centimeters of the shroud, and you can basically make it look brand new. However, you would have a very old ancient piece of linen fabric, and then you'd have a very new fibers that were at the top. So apparently there is evidence that the top bit was dyed, because these would be bright white or a lighter cream, and then there would be a much more darker yellow for the original fibers. And the reason why this was spotted was there was a woman who was like a sort of textile expert, and she was looking at the shroud, and she could see, because to the most people they wouldn't notice where the old weave and the new weave starts and finish, because it's seamless. You're pulling fibers into fibers. But she was a bit of an expert, and she said, to my eyes, I can see exactly where they've done the repair. And so she worked with the team in the 80s who were doing, and this is where the theory came out to say, actually, and there has been a paper published, I think in 2017. The paper that was published said that in conclusion that we can rule out the carbon dating. There is enough evidence to basically throw it all into contention. And the conclusion of the 1980s carbon dating cannot be sustained. So the official is that the carbon dating can, at least, if you're not going to agree to rule it out, you can at least park it for a moment. And actually, now that we've dated the cellulose with the other test, with the decomposition rate of the cellulose, and that's saying that it is 2,000 years old, not 700 years old, we can put the carbon dating to one side. I also saw something saying that they've looked at sort of they found a Jewish historical shroud, linen shroud, and it didn't use the herringbone weave, and they were arguing that the herringbone weave was very popular in the medieval times, and therefore it couldn't have been used, that the weave is not consistent historically. However, I looked into the history of herringbone weaves, and they found evidence for it at 600 BC in Ireland, and it's all across ancient civilization, the herringbone weave. The ancient Egyptians used it. It's in ancient Italy. So I don't think you can conclusively say that it's impossible for a herringbone weaved linen to have been found in the time that it was found. The image that we have from the shroud, you can take forensic evidence of the damage to the body shows up in the image, and it's the more you sort of look into it, the more crazy it is. I know historically Jesus is depicted as having a nail through the hands and a nail through the feet on the cross. However, there was an expert who he tested a bit morbid, but he tested on cadavers, I think in the 19th century, about the weight-bearing load of a hand. And basically, if you put a nail through the hand, after like a few minutes or a very short amount of time, it's not going. There's nothing here to stop to really hold up anything. It's just like really soft ligament and soft tissue. So it's gross to think about, but your hand, it's going to rip off. Your hands are going to rip off. The nail's just going to fly through your ligaments. So it's not feasible to put it through the actual hands. However, the guy on the shroud has a evidence of being skewered through the bottom here, like through the wrist, but at an angle that actually does come up through the center of the hand. So it's kind of a bit of both. It's not through the palm like this, it's through like this, which is actually horrendous, because now we know a lot more about like nervous systems and everything. So if you put your hand forward and make a little pinchy thing, you can actually, there's like a hole appears here. I don't like tendons, but there's actually like a major nerve system that runs through here, and if you pierce that, it is so much more painful than going through the hand. So not only would this be like weight bearing and weight loaded because your hand will hold your weight, but it's going to be horrendously and 1,000 times more painful. So they put them through the wrist, and then it would come out at the top of the hand. So kind of a bit of both. So evidence for like a anatomically correct weight load bearing crucifixion position. There is damage to the upper right shoulder of the man in the shroud, and the upper left shoulder blade has a big welt, big wound, which is consistent if you were going to be carrying a big weight load across one shoulder. It would come down the beam of the cross, because also the way that crucifixions work, they didn't carry the entire cross. The main part of the cross was already put into the ground, and you would carry your kind of cross load, just this one bar, and you wouldn't carry it like this. You'd carry it over your shoulder. And the damage on the body in the shroud is consistent with an injury here and a big injury on the back, which is very painful. There are over 300 lacerations, or lacerations isn't quite the word, 300 damages to the body, like kind of welts, that they don't believe actually broke the skin. I know that in Passion of the Christ, there's like a really gory moment where they were showing like the skin getting ripped off from getting the cat with 9 tails. But the Roman torture whip has kind of these like balls on the end of these metal balls on the end of this like leather whip. 3 of them. I think there's three tails of balls, or maybe 9 tails. Not sure. I'll find a picture. Anyway, the balls don't rip the skin open; they damage internally. So a great analogy was saying about you can get the most horrific, most painful injuries from like a motorbike accident, where you are essentially bleeding on the inside, but you don't break the skin, but it is so painful. It is like a bruise times 1,000. You are so internally damaged, but yet you haven't lost loads of blood, which is very clever torture technique, because you don't want people to lose too much blood because they die. So he had this dude in the shroud is showing consistent damage with like 340 of these lacerations. Now, not only this is where it gets very geeky and very like CSI forensic. The patterns of the lacerations on the body in the image in the shroud are consistent with the lacerations that would occur if you had 2 people alternately whipping this guy all over his body. And they know this because the lacerations are like forensically correct in the arc that they would appear. What am I meaning to say? I'm meaning to say that some of the lacerations on different parts of the body are aligned in different ways, and they are consistent together. So there are the ones down on the legs where the lacerations are on the wonk, and then as they move up the body, they're the different places that they are consistent with the arc of two arcs are going on. So there's two separate people, and they can even tell the height of the people who were making the lacerations, and one was shorter than the other. So one Roman soldier beating the crap out of this guy was a bit shorter than the other guy. But that is an insane detail. The lacerations lining up forensically with the arcs of the people abusing. If you were going to fake this, again, what a detail to include, because you are doing correct bruising in the correct shape, in the correct place. Fun to note, the man in the shroud is not wearing a loincloth. He's naked. His butt's out. You can't. He's got his arms folded across his front for modesty. But he was naked, which again would be more consistent. I know we always see Jesus hanging with a loincloth, but that's just for sort of church modesty. He would have been naked. So again, that's another more realistic, historical, the dude's not wearing pants. Also, interestingly, like anatomically, they found that the body wrapped in the linen, it was consistent with a 5'9" man. The man in the shroud was 5'9", which I found very interesting because I'm 5'9". So I'm like, am I the same height as Jesus? Was Jesus a short king? Now, when we think of the crown of thorns, we think of maybe like a wreath of crown, like somebody just like made a wreath of thorns and like smacked it on Jesus' head, like a kind of flower crown, if you like. That's not the crown that we see in the image in the shroud. It's more like a helmet of crown. Like somebody has taken a whack of this like really horrendous prickle bush that you get around the Middle East, and somebody's made like a kind of a circlet of something else, and they've wrapped this entire bush of thorns. And when they're alive, the thorn bush is quite flexible, but when they dry, they become as hard as nails. They are horrendous, big buggers as well, like big thorns. Anyway, somebody made like a kind of helmet, which is interesting because the word for crown, like the word in the Bible, we translate it as crown, and we think of crowns like medieval king crowns, but the word in the original Greek or the original Hebrew, whatever it's in, is actually more meaning priest crown, because the priests used to wear crowns or hats. So it's more like a priest hat than a king crown, if that makes sense. And if you look back at like old first century Jewish priest hats, they are more consistent with like a full hat thing. So it's really interesting. I never knew that about the hat. The crown of thorns in the shroud is more consistent with a historically accurate priest hat than it is to a medieval king's crown, like we have depicted it for hundreds of years. Some other things to note. I know I'm talking a lot, but some really cool things to note. There is pollen blooms, microscopic little bits of pollen. To be fair, there's lots of pollen from lots of places have been found on the shroud, to be fair, because the shroud's travelled, so it's picked up lots of different bits of dust and it's picked up all kinds of stuff. However, they have found a very particular kind of pollen that is only blooms between April and May in a very close proximity to Jerusalem. So that means that at some point the shroud has been in and around the area that it historically needed to have been in the time frame of like April to May. They also found microscopic bits of soil on the feet, knees and nose on the image, which is consistent with walking barefoot and falling onto your knees and falling literally flat on your face. I could go on and on and on about all of the like anatomical correct damages that is in the shroud. Like the guy's got a broken nose, he's got a swollen, he's consistent with being punched in the face. There is a side wound, which is exactly consistent to where the Romans would skewer the people on the cross when they did crucifixions. That's all completely there. And not only that, but the blood work, they found that the blood had split into like blood and water, which is something that happens. I think it's called basically the blood water ratio medically, forensically, it is consistent with someone who has been under extreme bodily stress and assault, because extreme blood loss, extreme stress, your blood can literally split into this like blood water ratio. A thing called pulmonary edema. So the dude in the shroud, there was evidence there that there was pulmonary edema, which is basically where your lungs start to fill with water, and it puts pressure on, because of pressure on your heart. This guy was under the most compounded stress. The body that we have this image of is showing that the dude went through something extreme. Also evidence that it's blood type AB. Don't know what that means, but AB. Historical reference to the shroud. So technically, we have like written evidence from 1354. The shroud turns up in a village in northern France, and that's the first time that it is like 100% in the history books. And then it's documented to have the fire in 1532. And then by 1570 something, that's when the shroud is travelled to Turin. And it's just been there ever since. So since the 1500s, after it got repaired, it got taken to Turin. And that is where it still is in today. And that's why it's called the Shroud of Turin. There's a priest called Andrew Dalton, who is like a kind of shroud expert. And I really recommend checking out his talks and his sort of podcasts on YouTube, because he goes into such detail about all of this. But he talks about there being the sort of the legends around the history of the shroud, because obviously the shroud turns up in the 1300s. However, he has a kind of like oral legend about how and where the shroud travelled from the 1st century until it became historically noted in the 13th century. I'm going to put a little insert of him explaining the story.
It's in Jerusalem, 33 AD. It's in Edessa soon after. It goes 544 in the building. It's there in Edessa until 944. So this is when Romanus I, who is emperor in modern day Istanbul, in Constantinople at the time, and he wants to gather together all the relics of Christ's passion under his roof. And so off it goes to Istanbul. But it's there until the Fourth Crusade. This is when European crusaders sack and pillage, basically. They steal these prized relics and bring it into Europe. And so it's not likely that they would have raised their hands and said, oh, look what I got, a little souvenir from sacking. No, instead it appears 150 years later in the hands of a French nobleman by the name of Geoffroy de Charny.
But yeah, so the shroud had different names. Obviously, it was only called the Shroud of Turin by the 1500s. At that point, it could have been 1500 years old. So it's been also called the Image of Edessa, the Mandylion. It would have had different names. A codex from the 1100s. This is a couple of 100 years before it turns up in the historical narrative. There is a depiction in this codex from 1192, and it shows what could be interpreted as the Shroud of Turin. Interesting, it shows like the weave, like a kind of cross weave. It shows the correct, position of Christ being laid down, and this shroud that's going to be folded over as the real one was. It also shows some little details. So specifically, there is some staining, or sort of, there's 7 little holes that are in the actual shroud. They kind of make like a number 7, or maybe there's not 7 holes. Maybe there's like there's a couple of holes that make like a very distinct number 7. And what's interesting is in this little like illustrated doodle of this shroud in this codex from the 11th century, they can also see the same little dots. So that's why a lot of people think that this was a illustration of the Shroud of Turin turning up a couple hundred years before it was like officially first turned up. So what do we think? What do you think? I'm very excited that the Shroud has come back into the mainstream, and it's coming back into conversation. I'm very excited that as technology is rolling on and improving, that I might be in the life cycle that works out how this was done, what this was done. What this was done? That's not even English. Where I sit with it is that now that we've got very good evidence that that the Shroud could be up to 2,000 years old, we've got evidence that points to some pretty miraculous mysteries. We don't know how this image could have been. We don't what mechanism or how this image was made. It's a real brain teaser, and that's why I love the Shroud of Turin. I think it's very possible that this could have been the Shroud from the actual. We do know that Jesus of Nazareth, he was a historical person. His crucifixion it's in the history books outside of the Bible. He is there's not even an argument. He was a real dude. Whether or not he was the Son of God, that's your own interpretation. But the actual dude who actually got crucified, historically, I don't see why the Shroud could not be his. If it was a real dude who really died, he would have really needed a shroud. And it makes a lot of sense that somebody would have kept the bindings of Jesus or stolen them at some point. It makes a lot of sense that they would have been kept for a long time. And it tracks, do you know what I mean? I'm saying that the legend tracks